Fox News Alert now as reports come in that an arrest warrant has been issued. This after a body was found less than a mile from the 23-year-old tight end's home.
Florida Gator football star Aaron Hernandez in jail tonight, charged with first-degree murder in the death of a semi-pro football player. Hernandez appeared before a judge just a few hours ago.
Aaron Hernandez, as mentioned, found guilty this afternoon of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Just into our newsroom, prison officials in Massachusetts confirming they found former New England Patriot and University of Florida standout Aaron Hernandez dead in his cell this morning. He apparently committed suicide using a bed sheet.
Hernandez's fiance is raising questions about the circumstances surrounding his death and that suicide note. She says she wants answers.
On April 14, 2017, Aaron Hernandez, once hailed as one of the most gifted football players of his generation and who seemed destined to one day be enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, sat in a Boston courtroom awaiting a jury's verdict on double murder charges. As the jurors concluded the deliberations and took their seats in the jury box, nearly everyone in the courtroom fully expected Hernandez would be found guilty as charged. Multiple witnesses had testified that, in July 2012, Hernandez, from the passenger seat of a friend's car, emptied a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver into an adjacent vehicle and killed two men he did not know, Daniel De Abreu and Safiro Furtado. But, against the expectations of many, the jury acquitted Hernandez, concluding prosecutors had failed to meet their burden to prove he was the triggerman. The scene that followed was a surreal snapshot of the contradictions that defined Hernandez's life. As the courtroom emptied, he turned to the gallery, blowing kisses and flashing a warm, almost boyish smile to his 4-year-old daughter Avielle and his fiancée, Cheyenne Jenkins. It was a moment of tenderness from a man the world had long perceived to be a killer. But as he was led away, the tenderness evaporated. Out of their sight, Hernandez's face hardened. Shackled once again, he was loaded into a waiting transport van that carried him back to Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Shirley, Massachusetts, back to the grim reality of a life sentence he was already serving for another murder, the 2013 killing of Odin Lloyd, a semi-pro football player who had once dated Cheyenne's sister. Back in prison, Hernandez returned to the rhythms and anxieties of life in a maximum security prison. But in the quiet of his cell, stripped of the swagger that carried him through his trials, Hernandez began to make preparations. Over the next 4 nights, he laid out the steps of an ending he had clearly considered for some time. And then, in the early hours of April 19, 2017, Hernandez put that plan into motion. He jammed cardboard into the tracks of his cell door to slow the guards. He smeared soap across the concrete floor, an insurance policy against his own second thoughts, preventing him from regaining his balance if his nerve faltered. Then he wrote 3 letters, one to Cheyenne, one to his daughter, and a third to a fellow inmate with whom he had grown close. He then took a thick red pen and scrawled on his forehead, John 3:16, and he opened his Bible to the same verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. From there he moved with precision. He stripped the sheets from his bed and tied them together, pulling the knots tight so they would not slip beneath the weight of his massive frame. He anchored one end of the makeshift rope to the bars of his narrow cell window and looped the other around his neck and climbed onto a chair. And, in a final act of brutality that had defined most of Hernandez's adult life, he kicked the chair away. At 3 a.m., a correctional officer making routine rounds peered into Hernandez's cell and saw him motionless, suspended by the sheet. The guard forced the door open, cut him down, and tried desperately to revive him. Paramedics rushed Hernandez to UMass Memorial Hospital, but it was already too late. Aaron Hernandez, once a titan of the NFL and a hero to millions of football fans, was dead by suicide. He was 27 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Aaron Hernandez.
There was at first suspicion that things were not as they seemed. Aaron Hernandez, narcissistic, cold, and brimming with machismo, had just walked away from a hard-fought double murder acquittal. Immediately after, his attorney, Jose Baez, confirmed Hernandez was appealing his conviction in the Odin Lloyd case, even suggesting that freedom might not be far off. And yet, despite that glimmer of hope, Hernandez was found hanging in his cell. For many, the suddenness felt too abrupt, too neatly timed. Whispers of conspiracy swirled, foreshadowing the frenzy that would erupt 2 years later with Jeffrey Epstein's death in custody. As with Epstein, the central question emerged. Why would a man who had lied, deceived, and manipulated so many for so long suddenly take his own life, just when his prospects seemed to brighten? Even Sheriff Thomas Hodgson, who had led the investigation in the Hernandez killing, said, quote, "He was a master manipulator. Suicide is something I never would have expected. He always kept complete control." But as quickly as rumors spread, they gave way to the harder truth of who Hernandez was and what he had become behind bars. He was the product of a violent, impoverished upbringing shaped by an abusive father and the chaos that came with it. In turn, he became violent himself, narcissistic, unforgiving, deeply troubled, and displaying the hallmarks of serious mental illness. On the field, he was a force of nature, fast, dominant, nearly unstoppable. Off of it, he was haunted and unpredictable. Teammates described a man who could shift without warning from hypermasculinity to startling sensitivity in the blink of an eye. Hernandez's Patriots teammate Brandon Lloyd recalled, quote, "There would be swings where he'd be the most hypermasculine, aggressive individual in the room, where he'd be ready to fight somebody in fits of rage. The next minute, he'd be the most sensitive person in the room, talking about cuddling with his mother." In prison, those contradictions sharpened. Hernandez grew increasingly introverted, rarely speaking and guarding himself from other inmates. He turned inward, clinging to faith as though it offered the only path left. He read the Bible constantly, consumed with the idea of redemption and salvation. To some, it was evidence of a man seeking peace, but to others, it was evidence of a deeply fractured soul, overwhelmed by the weight of his past and unable to envision a future, even one that might have brought him back into the world beyond prison walls.
Aaron Hernandez's suicide stunned the sports world, but it was merely the final violent act in his story. Those who knew Hernandez as a child described him as reserved, but sweet, and said his focus on football and his talent on the field kept him away from the street gangs that consumed many of his peers. Hernandez was only 16 when his father died unexpectedly after routine surgery, and the fragile scaffolding of his world gave way. Friends and family recalled that he refused to mourn, he shed no tears, and after the funeral, he never returned to his father's gravesite. Instead, he fashioned an armor of detachment, projecting toughness and indifference to anyone who looked too closely. The football field became his sanctuary and the place where he could maintain his illusion of invincibility. And invincible he was. At Bristol Central High School, Hernandez was a phenomenon, bigger, faster, and more dominant than anyone who lined up against him. He played both tight end and defensive end, a two-way force who seemed to bend the field to his will. His senior year numbers were staggering: 67 catches, over 1,800 yards, and 24 touchdowns, along with game-changing plays on defense. He shattered state records and was named Connecticut's Gatorade Football Player of the Year, with coaches and scouts praising him as perhaps the greatest high school football player the state had ever produced. That dominance carried him to the University of Florida, where he became a star on the national stage. Playing under legendary coach Urban Meyer, Hernandez was a key piece of an offense that featured Tim Tebow and routinely overwhelmed opponents. He earned consensus All-American honors in 2009 and helped the Gators win the national championship. Meyer called him one of the most gifted athletes he'd ever coached, and NFL scouts drooled over his combination of size, speed, and hands. Even then, there were whispers about his off-field behavior, but his talent was too immense to ignore. In the NFL, Hernandez wasted no time proving the hype was real. Drafted by the New England Patriots in 2010, he quickly formed one of the most feared tight end duos in league history alongside Rob Gronkowski. In just 3 years, he had 175 receptions, 1,956 yards, and 18 touchdowns, production that rivaled Hall of Fame trajectories. The Patriots rewarded him with a $39.5 million extension, making him one of the highest-paid tight ends in history. People forget, Derek, that Rob Gronkowski has become the greatest tight end ever in the history of football. When they were both in the field together, Hernandez was a star. Gronkowski was second fiddle.
I completely agree, and he was playing with the GOAT. I mean, Tom Brady was the quarterback of those teams. He had those two tight ends, and the offense really was built largely around those two tight ends. They had those slot receivers. He had Randy Moss a few years, but it was the tight end set that they could put out on the field with Aaron Hernandez and Rob Gronkowski that was unstoppable. And to your point, Gronkowski has grown in people's estimation to the guy, but Aaron Hernandez was something else, and he was actually considered by football heads to be the better player and less sort of the flashy Rob Gronkowski off-the-field personality. Aaron Hernandez was a beast.
It's not to say that Gronkowski wouldn't have become what he did even with Hernandez. He was every year, Gronkowski getting better and better and became, again, maybe the greatest tight end ever. But Hernandez was every bit as good, and I think that's lost because of everything that's gone on since. we've lost sight about how damn good he was. Maybe it doesn't matter, but God, he was fantastic.
And he was big, strong. There were no holes in his game. And he also, although all of the things about his off-the-field behavior, they weren't really apparent to fans because he was dashingly handsome. He flashed those smiles. He looked like a player you could really build around and rally around. It was just there was this dark history and this dark sort of other life that he led that came to light with the murders of Odin Lloyd and others. Through all the success, though, there were whispers about his off-field behavior. At Florida, Hernandez developed a reputation as both gifted and volatile. He reportedly failed multiple drug tests for marijuana, and teammates described a young man who could be magnetic in one moment and deeply menacing the next. Urban Meyer and his staff often kept a close eye on him, balancing discipline with a desire to protect one of their brightest stars. There were also brushes with violence. His name surfaced in connection with a Gainesville shooting in 2007, though no charges were filed. For many scouts, these warning signs raised questions, but none strong enough to override what they saw on the field. I wanted to raise a quick point about his off-the-field violence. I worked here when these stories broke, and with our sports desk, I remember getting the lawsuits about a shooting at a club where someone was injured, and reading them and being just shocked that Aaron Hernandez, it seemed like a junk lawsuit that couldn't possibly be true about an incident at a club. And then when all the dominoes started to fall, we would go back and look at these lawsuits. Was he shooting people at clubs because he was angered over the slightest provocations? I remember these were spilled drinks and things like that, where he would erupt in violence and rage and shoot at people.
We're going to talk more about this in a minute, but one of the things whispered about him, we would never say this as a media organization because we don't know that it's true, but police investigated him in 6 different murders and fingered him as a potential suspect in 6. It wasn't just that he was involved, and they knew that he was around. They believed at one point, and maybe still do, that he is the personal trigger man for 6 different killings.
Yeah, it gives a different complexion. The gravity of this is not a single homicide like an O.J. Simpson type situation where he was enraged about his ex-wife and seeing her. This is a situation where there were serial homicides, and he was potentially involved in several of them. So it had a different complexion. And those patterns followed him into the NFL. In New England, Hernandez dazzled fans and coaches alike, but behind closed doors, he gravitated toward the same risky environments that had shadowed him in college. He maintained ties to childhood friends from Bristol, some of whom were deeply entrenched in gang culture. Reports of late-night fights, reckless behavior, and substance abuse began to circulate. Yet the Patriots organization, with its culture of winning and silence, rarely let such issues surface publicly. To those who knew him, it seemed Hernandez was living a double life, one as a young millionaire star, the other as a man unable or unwilling to escape the pull of darker influences. In the ensuing years, Hernandez's ties to old friends deepened. He carried guns, surrounded himself with people who would follow his orders, and picked fights that seemed rooted in slights, real or imagined. And then in 2013, Hernandez lured semi-pro football player Odin Lloyd, who was dating the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, into an industrial park outside Boston. Hours later, Lloyd was found dead, riddled with bullets. The arrest that followed ended Hernandez's football career in an instant, transforming him from one of the NFL's brightest stars into a convicted murderer, shackled by a life sentence. Looking back, those closest to Hernandez in New England, despite hearing the rumors, said they never saw the full picture. Patriots owner Robert Kraft said he felt duped by Hernandez, believing the young star had bought into the team's culture. Bill Belichick, famously tight-lipped, later acknowledged the organization had tried to provide support, but ultimately misjudged the situation. And Tom Brady said he was unaware of the extent of his teammates' continued involvement in gang life, and called it, quote, a tragedy all the way around. To the most powerful figures in the franchise, Hernandez was a teammate who could be trusted, and they were blindsided to learn otherwise.
Do you buy those quotes from those 3 guys? I mean, this is
the culture of the Patriots makes you question.
That's right. The culture of the Patriots was one of the rules only apply to the extent that they allow us to continue to succeed.
That's right.
We saw it over and over again.
Spygate and so forth.
I don't think we're saying anything that's too negative to the Patriots. This is the way they operated, and I don't think they really apologized for that. They sort of did this stuff and were
very successful.
And very successful.
Yeah.
The rumors about Hernandez were running rampant, and I think they did try to sort of intervene a little bit and ask him what was going on, if they could help him in any way. When he said no, I think they were saying, all right, keep producing.
Yeah, I think they wanted to hear from Aaron, I'm fine. And once they heard that, they were like, well, we've checked that box. That's sort of the culture, I think, that was created. They would intervene as long as it didn't sort of interfere with football. They were the Spygate, they were Deflategate. They cared about what was between the lines and winning football games. I don't think they were complicit in cover-ups and things of that nature. I don't believe that was true, but I think they heard what they wanted to hear and were able to get comfortable enough to continue the train.
The other question, do we expect more of an NFL team? Should we expect more? I mean, their job is to put a winning product on the field. Obviously, to your point, they're not going to engage in cover-ups.
And those things are aligned, right? Yeah. If he stops knucklehead behavior off the field and dangerous behavior, it makes him a better football player too. So I don't think they turned a blind eye, but they wanted it to get better. I'm sure everyone was aligned in the same direction.
After his arrest for Odin Lloyd's murder, the floodgates opened. Investigators began digging into Hernandez's past, and what emerged was darker than almost anyone had imagined. He was soon linked to a string of violent incidents. The 2012 drive-by shootings of Daniel De Abreu and Sofia Furtado we talked about earlier, an alleged 2013 shooting in Florida that wounded a former friend, and multiple reports of drug use, threats, and reckless behavior stretching back years. Each revelation chipped away at the image of the charismatic young tight end and replaced it with a portrait of a man living a secret life steeped in violence and crime. To the public, it was impossible to believe. Hernandez had been a world-class athlete, a household name with generational wealth by the time he was 24. And yet the reality was something closer to a gangster saga. I read this quote, Derek, from Shannon Sharp, Hall of Famer turned football analyst, who, like Hernandez, grew up completely impoverished, surrounded by gang violence everywhere he looked, before he finally struck it rich in the NFL. And he said about Hernandez, quote, once you reach a certain level, once you reach a professional athlete status, a lot of guys leave that life behind, meaning the gang life and the life that they grew up with. Aaron Hernandez could not. He could not. He was not a studio gangster. He was a for-real gang member, and that was a part of him that was equally as important to him as playing football in the National Football League for the New England Patriots. And I think that's so interesting. We talked about, Charles Barkley is one who's talked about if he was not great at basketball, he would now be in jail or dead.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I mean, there's been movies about this, Boys in the Hood. When someone is an athlete, often they are sort of connected to gang life, protected, but they're looked at as someone who can break out, and they're often allowed to go achieve those dreams, and the gang doesn't necessarily drag them back in. It seems with Aaron Hernandez, he was a true gangbanger. He was in that life, and he was also an athlete, but it wasn't incidental to him. And so I think escaping, you have to put some agency on him, but I do think it is more difficult when you're a member of a gang in a serious way and sort of a soldier.
I think Shannon Sharp's point is, obviously you and I can only talk about what we've read. We've never experienced anything like this. But I think Shannon Sharp's point is there are a lot of guys who are heavily involved in the gang life. Then they become professional athletes and they're able to leave it behind. They have the money, they have the security, they have a network of people around them that care about them, maybe for the first time in their lives. And they've got this now, and then it's easy to turn your back on him. Aaron Hernandez had all those things. He had people who cared about him. He had
plenty of money.
He had plenty of money, and one of the great organizations in professional sports surrounding him. But that life for him was too much, and he didn't want to turn his back on it, whereas many others did.
Yeah, the one question I'll leave is, did Aaron Hernandez give any indication he wanted to leave that life behind? Because there are some people who are pulled in, and they can't escape it, and the violence and the threats are too much, and their families are brought into it, and they feel trapped. I'm not sure Aaron Hernandez really indicated that was his case.
He was horribly abused by his father growing up. He clearly suffered from a number of mental illnesses. It was too. He did not want to give it up. There's no indication he ever wanted, because he
at least at the front of his mind.
He could have walked away. That doesn't mean not supporting the kids you grew up with or whatever it is, your friends from home. It just means giving up the criminal lifestyle. It's not something he ever wanted to give up.
Yeah, it didn't look like he was trying to break away. And in prison, Hernandez kept up the same facade of control he had demonstrated with the Patriots. Guards and officials described him as calm, even charming, someone who seemed entirely at ease in confinement. Sheriff Hodgson said Hernandez never once showed a flash of vulnerability. That's why his sweet smile and blown kisses to his young daughter in the Boston courtroom days before his death unsettled him. To Hodgson, it was a break in the armor. Something had gotten inside that Hernandez couldn't hold back. In his final days, Hernandez seemed lighter to some. He joked with court clerks, teased about needing a haircut despite being bald, and even gave away belongings to fellow inmates. He joined pickup basketball games, started fitness routines with others, and appeared unusually upbeat. Many hoped this newfound optimism was genuine, but instead, it was the calm of a man who had already decided how his life would end. Following his suicide, rumors surfaced that Odin Lloyd had been killed after discovering Hernandez in a compromising sexual encounter with another man. Hernandez, according to reports, denied this to a fellow inmate just days before his death. But the speculation gained traction in the wake of his suicide, fueled by a broader conversation about his sexuality and the secrecy with which he lived his life. For many, it offered a possible explanation for his volatility, an elite athlete raised in a hypermasculine world carrying a hidden truth he felt he could never reveal. The theory was never proven, yet it lingered because it fit the puzzle of a man whose life was defined by contradictions. Hernandez projected toughness, aggression, and bravado on the field, yet those closest to him described moments of deep vulnerability and sensitivity off the field. If he had been struggling with his sexuality, the pressures of the NFL, his upbringing, and the culture he inhabited might have made that struggle just unbearable. Others looked for answers in different places, pointing to the heavy drug use that had shadowed him since his teenage years, or to the possibility that CTE, the degenerative brain disease that plagues football players, had clouded his judgment and fueled his violent impulses. Those suspicions were confirmed after his death when researchers at Boston University revealed Hernandez's brain did indeed show signs of the condition.
Hernandez's death also triggered a bizarre legal turn. Under Massachusetts law, a doctrine called abatement ab initio required that Hernandez's conviction in the Odin Lloyd case be erased because his appeal was still pending. Legally, it was as if the guilty verdict had never existed. Hernandez was no longer a convicted murderer, but a man who, in the eyes of the courts, had never stood trial at all. The ruling was not just a legal absurdity, but also raised the possibility that the Patriots might be forced to pay out millions in bonuses they had withheld when he was arrested, while at the same time throwing new obstacles in front of lawsuits filed by Odin Lloyd's family. Even in death, Hernandez seemed to evade accountability and resolution. In the end, the tragedy of Aaron Hernandez is not just about his own downfall, but the wreckage left in his wake, the lives he took, the shattered families, and the loved ones who must carry the weight of his choices. Hernandez's daughter will grow up without ever knowing her father or feeling the pride of his brilliance on the field. And for Cheyenne Jenkins, who called him her soulmate, the memories will forever be tangled of the man she saw as an amazing father, an amazing athlete, a very, very strong person, and of the dark truth that ultimately defined him.